Okay, I think we are live. So let's see, we don't have any viewers yet. Okay. All right, I think I will begin, but if you guys don't see anything, then let me know. So hello, everyone, and welcome to SDS's Virtual Reading and Discussion of Trifles by Susan Glassbell. I'm Charlie Beal. I've been the director of this project, and I will be your host this evening. We are excited to perform the show in the virtual format, more than a century after it premiered in the Provincetown Playhouse in 1916. While it's a fairly short one-act, Trifles certainly covers a lot of ground, and it's hard to fit into just one genre. On the one hand, it's a murder mystery, based loosely on a murder case Glassbell reported on when she was a journalist in Iowa. In the real-life case, a woman was suspected of murdering her husband with an axe. While initially, Glassbell painted this woman in the press as a cold, ruthless killer, she grew to be more sympathetic and understanding as she learned more. Glassbell later turned this experience into Trifles, being an original cast member as well as the playwright and the co-owner of the Provincetown Playhouse. On the other hand, it's a social commentary, peering into the everyday lives of people in the early 1900s. We see the male characters exude authority, many times to a misogynistic degree, and the female characters fighting against this in a subtle yet ingenious way. Glassbell's time was one of social revolution, as progressive era movements sought reform in all areas of society. And another pandemic brought widespread death and hardship to the world. As we read through Trifles and discuss it afterwards, we hope you too will think about the parallels between Glassbell's world and ours, as well as the progress, or in some cases lack thereof, we've made in the intervening years. Furthermore, if you'd like to follow on with the reading, you can access the script by clicking the link in the description. You'll also find in the description a virtual playbill where you can learn more about the cast and crew. For three of our cast members, Cindy Tran, Elsa Maroney, and Christopher Roddy, this is their SDS debut. It's been great getting to know them over the course of this project, and I wish them many more shows with SDS in the future. And to Alexander Markoulis and Phuc Bui, the two other cast members and good friends of mine with whom I shared the stage before, I'm happy to see them back. Without further ado, this is Trifles. Scene. The kitchen is the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen and left without having been put in order. Unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, other signs of incompleted work. At the rear, the outer door opens and the sheriff comes in, followed by the county attorney and Hale. The sheriff and Hale are men in middle life. The county attorney is a young man. All are much bundled up and go at once to the stove. They are followed by the two women. The sheriff's wife first. She is a slight, wiry woman with a thin, nervous face. Mrs. Hale is larger and would ordinarily be called more comfortable looking, but she is disturbed now and looks fearfully about as she enters. The women have come in slowly and stand close together near the door.
This feels good. Come up to the fire, ladies.
I'm not cold.
Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning, all right?
By the way, has anything been moved? Are things as you left them yesterday?
Looks just about the same. When it dropped below zero last night, I thought I'd better send Frank out this morning to make a fire for us. No use getting pneumonia with a big case on, but I told him not to touch anything except the stove, and you know Frank.
Well, somebody should have been left here yesterday.
So, yesterday. When I had to send Frank to Morris Center for that man who went crazy, I want you to know, I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get back from Omaha by today, and as long as I went over everything here myself.
Well, Mr. Hale, Tell just what happened when you came here yesterday morning.
Harry and I had started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, I'm going to see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying folks talk too much already. And all he asked was some peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself. I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John.
Let's talk about that later, Mr. Hale. I do want to talk about that, but tell now just what happened when you got to the house.
Well, I didn't hear or see anything. I knocked at the door, and still it was all quiet inside. I knew they must be up. It was past 8 o'clock. So I knocked again, and I thought I heard somebody say, come in. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure yet, but I opened the door, this door, and there in that rocker sat Mrs. Wright.
They all look at the rocker.
What was she doing?
Well, she was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand, and she was kind of pleating it.
And how did she look?
Well, she looked queer.
How do you mean, queer?
Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next. And kind of done up.
And how did she seem to feel about your coming?
Well, I don't think she minded, one way or another. She didn't pay much attention. I said, how do, Mrs. Wright? It's cold, ain't it? And she said, is it? And went on kind of pleating at her apron. Well, I was surprised, and she didn't ask me to come up to the stove or to sit down, but just sat there, not even looking at me. So I said, I want to see John. And then she laughed. I guess you would call it a laugh. Well, I thought of Harry and the team outside, so I said a little sharp, can't I see John? And she says, no, kind of dull, like, well, ain't he home, says I. Well, yes, says she, he's home. Then why can't I see him? I asked her out of patience. Well, because he's dead, says she. Well, dead, says I. Well, she just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, but rocking back and forth. Well, why? Where is he? Says I, not knowing what to say. Well, she just pointed upstairs, like that. Well, I got up with the idea of going up there. I walked from there to here, and then I says, why? What did he die of? He died of a rope around his neck, says she, and just kind of went on pleating at her apron. Well, I went out and called Harry. I thought I might need help. Well, we went upstairs, and there he was, lying.
I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs, where you can point it all out. Just go on now with the rest of the story.
Well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked... But Harry, he went up to him, and he said, no, he's dead, all right, and we'd better not touch anything. So we went back downstairs, and she was still sitting that same way. Has anybody been notified? I asked. No, she says, unconcerned. Well, who did this, Mrs. Wright? Says Harry. He said it like business-like, and she stopped pleating of her apron. I don't know, she says. You don't know, says Harry. No, says she. Well, weren't you sleeping in the bed with him, says Harry. Yes, says she, but I was on the inside. Somebody slipped a rope round his neck and strangled him, and you didn't wake up, says Harry. I didn't wake up, she said after him. I mean, we must have looked as if we didn't see how that could be, for after a minute she said, I sleep sound. Well, Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said maybe we ought to let her tell her story first to the coroner or the sheriff. So Harry went as fast as he could to River's place where there's a telephone.
And what did Mrs. Wright do when she knew that you had gone for the coroner?
Well, she moved from that chair to this one right here, and just sat there with like her hands held together and looking down. I got a feeling that I ought to make some conversation, so I said I had come in to see if John wanted to put in a telephone, and that made her start to laugh, and then she stopped and looked at me scared. I don't know, maybe it wasn't scared. I wouldn't like to say it was. Soon Harry got back, and then Dr. Lloyd came, and you, Mr. Peters. So I guess that's all I know that you don't.
I guess we'll go upstairs first, and then out to the barn, and around there. You're convinced that there was nothing important here? Nothing that would point to any motive?
Nothing here but kitchen things.
The county attorney, after again looking around the kitchen, opens the door of a cupboard closet. He gets up on a chair and looks on a shelf, pulls his hand away, sticky.
Ugh, here's a nice mess.
The women draw nearer.
Oh, her fruit. It did freeze. She's worried about that when it turned so cold. She said the fire would go out and her drawers would break.
Well, can you beat the women? Held for murder and worrying about her preserves.
Well, I guess before we're through here, she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about.
Well, women are used to worrying over trifles.
The two women move a little closer together.
And yet, for all their worries, what would we do without the ladies?
The women do not unbend. He goes to the sink, takes a dipperful of water from the pail, and pouring it into a basin, washes his hands. Starts to wipe them off on a roller towel and pulls it for a cleaner place.
Ugh, dirty towels.
He kicks his foot against the pans under the sink.
Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies?
There's a great deal of work to be done on the farm.
To be sure, and yet, I know there are some Dickinson County farmhouses who don't have such roller towels.
Those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be.
Loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Mrs. Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too.
I've not seen much of her late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year.
And why was that? You didn't like her?
I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson. And then
Yes?
it never seemed a very cheerful place.
No. It's not cheerful. I shouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct.
Well, I don't know as Wright had either.
You mean that they didn't get on very well?
No, I don't mean anything, but I don't think a place would be any cheerfuler for John Wright's being in it.
You know, I'd like to talk more of that a little later. I want to get the lay of things upstairs.
I suppose anything Mrs. Peters does will be all right. She was to take in some clothes for her, you know, and a few little things we left in such a hurry yesterday.
Yes, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us.
Yes, Mr. Henderson.
The women listen to the men's steps on the stairs. Then they look about the kitchen.
I'd hate to have men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing.
She arranges the pans under the sink, which the lawyer had shoved out of place.
Of course, it's no more than their duty.
Duty's all right, but I guess that deputy sheriff that came out to make the fire might have got a little of this on. Wish I'd thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her not having things slicked up when she had to come away in such a hurry.
Mrs. Peters has gone to a small table in the left rear corner of the room and lifted one end of a towel that covers a pan.
She had bread set.
Mrs. Hale fixes her eyes on a loaf of bread beside the bread box, which is now on a low shelf at the other side of the room. She moves slowly towards it.
She was going to put this in there.
She picks up the bread, then abruptly drops it, in a manner of returning to familiar things.
It's a shame about her fruit. I wonder if it's all gone.
She gets up on the chair and looks.
I think there's some here that's all right, Mrs. Peters. Yes, here. This is cherries, too. I declare I believe it's the only one.
She gets down, bottle in her hand. She goes to the sink and wipes it off on the outside.
She'll feel awful bad after all her hard work in the hot weather. I remember the afternoon I put up my cherries last summer.
She puts the bottle on the big kitchen table, center of the room. With a sigh, is about to sit down in the rocking chair. Before she is seated, realizes what chair it is. With a slow look at it, steps back. The chair which she has touched rocks back and forth.
Well, I must get these things from the front room closet. You coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You could help me carry them.
They go into the other room, then reappear. Mrs. Peters carrying a dress and skirt, Mrs. Hale following with a pair of shoes.
My, it's cold in there.
She puts the clothes on the big table, then hurries to the stove.
Right was close. I guess maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part. And then, you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. This all you was taken?
She said she wanted an apron. Funny thing to want, for there isn't much to get you dirty in jail, goodness knows. I suppose just to make her feel more natural. She said they were in the top drawer in this cupboard. Yes, here. And her little shawl that always hung behind the door.
She opens the stair door and looks.
Yes, here it is.
She then quickly shuts the door, leading upstairs.
Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
do you think she did it?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, I don't think she did. Asking for an apron and her little shawl, worrying about her fruit.
Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in speech, and he make fun of her, saying she didn't wake up.
Well, I guess John Reich didn't wake up when they was slipping that rope under his neck.
No, it's strange. It must have been done awful crafty and still. They say it was such a funny way to kill a man. Ringing it up all like that?
That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand.
Mr. Henderson said coming out was what was needed for the case, was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling.
Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here.
She puts her hand on the dish towel which lies on the table, stands looking down at the table, one half of which is clean, the other half messy.
It's wiped to here.
She makes a move as if to finish work, then turns and looks at the loaf of bread outside the bread box. She drops the towel, in that voice of coming back to familiar things.
Wonder how they're finding things upstairs. I hope she had it a little more read up there. You know, it seems kind of sneaking, locking her up in town and then coming out here trying to get her own house to turn against her.
Mrs. Hale, the law's the law.
I suppose it is. Better loosen up your things, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out.
Mrs. Hale begins unbuttoning her coat, and Mrs. Peters takes off her fur tippet, goes back to hang it on the hook at the back of the room, and stands looking at the under part of the small corner table.
She was piercing a quilt.
She brings the large sewing basket, and they look at the bright pieces.
It's a log cabin pattern. Pretty, isn't it? I wonder if she's going to quilt it or just knot it.
Footsteps have been heard coming down the stairs. The sheriff enters, followed by Hale and the county attorney.
And they wonder if she was going to quilt it or knot it.
Oh, Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Well, let's go out to the barn and get that cleared up.
The men go outside.
I don't know if there's anything so strange or taking up our time with little things while waiting for them to get to the evidence.
She sits down at the big table, smoothing out a block with decision.
I don't see as it's anything to laugh about.
Of course, they got awful important things on their minds.
Mrs. Peters pulls up a chair and joins Mrs. Hale at the table. Mrs. Hale is examining another block.
Mrs. Peters, look at this one. Here, this is the one she was working on. Look at the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even. Look at this. It's all over the place. Why, It looks as if she didn't know what she was about.
After she has said this, they look at each other, then start to glance back at the door. After an instant, Mrs. Hale has pulled at a knot and ripped the sewing.
Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale?
Just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good. Bad sewing always made me fidgety.
I don't think we ought to touch things.
I'll just finish up this end. Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
what do you suppose she was so nervous about?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if she was nervous. I sometimes feel awful queer when I'm just tired. Well, I must get these things wrapped up. They may be through sooner than we think. I wonder where I can find a piece of paper. String.
In that cupboard, maybe?
Mrs. Peters goes to look in the cupboard.
Why? Here's a bird cage. Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?
Why, I don't know whether she did or not. I've not been here for so long. There was a man around last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know if she took one. Maybe she did. She used to sing real pretty herself.
Seems funny to think of a bird here. But she must have had one, or why would she have a cage? I wonder what happened to it.
Suppose maybe the cat got it.
No, she didn't have a cat. She got that feeling some people have about cats, being afraid of them. My cat got in her room, and she was real upset, and asked me to take it out.
My sister Bessie was like that. Queer, ain't it?
Mrs. Peters is examining the cage.
Why? Look at this door. It's broke. One hinge just pulled apart.
Looks as if someone must have been rough with it.
Why, yes.
She brings the cage forward and puts it on the table.
I wish if they're going to find any evidence they'd be about it. I don't like this place.
I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be lonesome for me sitting here alone.
It would, wouldn't it? But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish I'd come over sometimes when she was here. I wish I had.
You're awful busy, Mrs. Hale. Your house and your children.
I could have come. I stayed away because it weren't cheerful, and that's why I ought to have come. I've never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road. I don't know what it is. But it's a lonesome place and always was. I wish I'd come over to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see now.
Well, you mustn't reapproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. Somehow, we just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up.
Not having children makes less work, but it makes a quiet house and ride out to work all day and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters?
Not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man.
Yes, good. He didn't drink. He kept his word as well as most, I guess. And he paid his debts. But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters. Just to pass the time of day with him. Like a raw wind that gets to the bone. I should think she would have wanted a bird. But what do you suppose went with it?
I don't know, unless it got sick and died.
She reaches over and swings the broken door, then swings it again. Both women watch it.
You weren't raised around here, were you? You didn't know her?
Not till they brought her yesterday.
Come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself. Real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. Tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why don't you take the quilting with you? It might take up her mind.
Why, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. There couldn't possibly be any objection to it, could there? Now, just what I take. I wonder if her patcher's in here, and her things.
They start to look in the sewing basket.
Here's some red. I expect this has got sewing things in it.
She brings out a fancy box.
What a pretty box. Looks like something somebody would give you. Maybe her scissors are in here.
She opens the box, then suddenly puts her hand to her nose.
Why?
Mrs. Peters bends nearer, then turns her face away.
There's something wrapped up in this piece of silk.
Why, this isn't her scissors?
Mrs. Hale lifts
Peters,
the silk, and Mrs. Peters bends closer.
It's the bird.
Mrs. Hale now jumps up.
But Mrs. Peters, look at its neck. Look at its neck. It's all other side too.
Somebody's wrung its neck.
Their eyes meet, a look of growing comprehension, of horror. Steps are heard outside. Mrs. Hale slips the box under quilt pieces and sinks into her chair. Enter the sheriff and the county attorney. Mrs. Peters rises. County attorney. Interesting. Oh, okay.
Sorry, I lost connection.
That's okay.
Well, ladies, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or not it?
We think she was going to knot it.
Well, that's interesting, I'm sure. Has the bird flown?
We think the cat got it.
Oh, is there a cat?
Mrs. Hale glances in a quick, covert way at Mrs. Peters.
Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave.
Anyway, no sign at all of anyone having come from the outside. Their own rope. Now, let's go up again and go over it piece by piece. It would have had to have been someone who just knew the...
The men exit. Mrs. Peters sits down. The two women sit there, not looking at one another, but as if peering into something and at the same time holding back. When they talk now, it is in the manner of feeling their way over strange ground, as if afraid of what they were saying, but as if they cannot help saying it.
She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in that pretty box.
When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy, took a hatchet, and before my eyes, and before I could get there, if I hadn't held back, I would have hurt him.
I wonder how it would seem never to have had any children around. No, Wright wouldn't like the bird. A thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that too.
We don't know who killed the bird.
I knew John Wright.
It was an awful thing done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale. Killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him.
His neck choked the life out of him.
Her hand goes out and rests on the bird cage.
We don't know who killed him. We don't know.
If there had been years and years of nothing, and then a bird to sing to you, it would be awful still after the bird was still.
I know what stillness is. When we homesteaded in Dakota and my first baby died, after he was 2 years old, and me with no other than...
How soon do you suppose they'll be through looking for evidence?
I know what stillness is. The law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale.
I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster while she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang. I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that?
We mustn't take on.
I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live close together. We live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's just a different kind of the same thing.
She brushes her eyes and notices the bottle of fruit. She reaches out for it.
If I were you, I wouldn't tell her her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this in to prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not.
Mrs. Peters takes the bottle, looks about for something to wrap it in. She takes her petticoat from the clothes brought from the other room, very nervously begins winding this around the bottle. In a false voice.
My, it's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh, getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary? As if that could have anything to do with, wouldn't they laugh?
The men are heard coming down the stairs.
Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't.
No, Peters. It's all perfectly clear except a reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, that would connect up with this strange way of doing it.
The women's eyes meet for an instant. Enter Hale from the outer door.
Well, I've got the team around. It's pretty cold out there.
You know, I'm gonna stay here a while by myself. You can send Frank out for me, can't you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better.
So, do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in then?
The lawyer goes to the table, picks up the apron, and laughs.
Oh, well, guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out.
He moves a few things about, disturbing the quilt pieces which cover the box. He then steps back.
No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, Sheriff's wife is married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters?
Not just that way.
She's married to the law. I just want you to come here in a minute, George. We ought to take a look at these windows.
Oh, windows.
We'll be right out, Mr. Hale.
Hale goes outside. The sheriff follows the county attorney into the other room. Then Mrs. Hale rises, hands tight together, looking intensely at Mrs. Peters, whose eyes make a slow turn, finally meeting Mrs. Hale's. A moment Mrs. Hale holds her, then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly, Mrs. Peters throws back quilt pieces and tries to put the box in the bag she is wearing. It is too big. She opens the box, starts to take the bird out, cannot touch it, and goes to pieces, standing there helpless. There's a sound of a knob turning in the other room. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and puts it in the pocket of her big coat. Enter the county attorney and the sheriff.
Well, Henry, at least we found out that she wasn't going to quilting. She was gonna... What do you call it, ladies?
We call it knotted, Mr. Henderson.
And curtain. All right. Whoa. So a very, very short but very heavy one act. That was a great read through, guys. Thank you so much. So now we're going to move into the Q&A discussion section of this event. If the audience has any questions, they can ask those questions in the YouTube chat, and we will try our best to answer some of them. I also have a few questions prepared, so I'll probably start with those to give the audience some time to maybe ponder a little bit, and we can start to hear from the cast on some topics discussed in this play. So definitely we cover a lot of ground in this play. I think that each character really gives us a look into sort of a different individual perspective of the early 1900s in the US. You really have 5 personalities that are similar in some ways, but also very different and unique. So I think we'll start with Chris, who played the county attorney. And we can start talking about the justice system a little bit in the early 1900s, because I think definitely back then, attorneys, especially on the national level for big criminal cases like murder, there were these really hotshot attorneys who were known to sort of make spectacles out of these cases. They would try to stun the jury with shocking pieces of evidence or facts. And the American public really ate this up by reading along in the newspapers. So, Chris, can you talk a little bit about how Glaspell sort of manifests this a little in the county attorney's character in this play?
Yeah, of course. So clearly, Glaspell didn't have the most favorable view of the of the justice system, and this is heavily reflected in the county attorney. Obviously, he's not a great guy. He's a lot less interested in the justice of the case and more in, I guess, stroking his own ego or maybe furthering his own career. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, we can definitely get a sense towards the end of the play of how the county attorney is increasingly frustrated on how he's not finding that that motive, something that would clearly point to the Mrs. Wright committing the crime. And yeah, I think that kind of shocks him a little bit because he might going in be thinking that it's an easy case, like it's done and dusted. But definitely that's, for him, he can't find any evidence at the end. So we have a look at the justice system a little bit in Susan Glaspell's time. And we also have a look at the policing system a little bit, of course, with the sheriff, who is played by Fook. So I think a big part of the sheriff's character is how he establishes authority in this play. So Fook, do you want to go into how the character does that?
So, just as a very important thing, I should note that the sheriff has a total of 10 lines, and of those 10 lines, 9 of them, I think, are about establishing his authority. And the very first line you hear me say is, excuse me a moment. Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning. And so what that means is the sheriff is setting himself up as the guy to facilitate everything. This entire investigation hinges upon him. And the rest of his lines are all about him establishing his story as the authoritative story, and the one saying, everyone else, you don't have any perspective in this. I know this town. I know what goes on, and that is what happened. Nothing else matters. So it's all about him establishing his arrogance over everyone else's perspective, and at the same time dealing with a county attorney who's evidently trying to usurp this authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, those are all very good points. And yeah, you're right to mention that, he only has a few lines throughout the course of the play, but definitely he makes his presence known with those lines, and is trying to indicate, especially to the county attorney, that he's the one in charge here. So we have these two men, the sheriff and the county attorney, who are investigating. But then we also have Mr. Hale, who's played by Alex. And Mr. Hale is the indirect witness to this case. He kind of gives a lot of the background to it at the beginning of the show. But we've also, Alex and I have talked a lot about how it's hard to tell where Mr. Hale falls on the spectrum of gender dynamics and women's rights at the time. He maybe isn't totally in support of it, but also it's hard to say if he's totally against it. So Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about this kind of middle ground that Hale is in for this play?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of Hale's lines are, of course, just describing the events as he saw them, but there's one very important line, which is actually the title line, which is when he says, well, women are always used to worrying over trifles. But I think the important thing about that line is it comes right after the county attorney and the sheriff both sort of poke fun at the women for worrying over what they seem as are very trivial things. So I think based on that, Hale is sort of placed in this middle ground of he's like not quite sure if he should be engaging in this misogynist sort of behavior, but at the same time he's not really in a position to come out and just say, hey guys, this maybe we shouldn't be saying these kinds of things, especially since the sheriff and the county attorney are in such high levels of authority and Hale just simply isn't. So it's just easier for him to sort of go along with it, even if he might not entirely agree with everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a good point that you make too, of how it's very difficult to usurp that authority overtly, I guess, and try to call out the sheriff or the county attorney. But I think probably the really sort of ingenious part of this play is how the women are able to subvert that authority and usurp it. But it's in definitely a more subtle way. So I think I'll just make the point here, if it wasn't clear in the reading, because it is sort of ambiguous. But the women come to the conclusion when they find the dead canary. They believe that Mr. Wright has likely been the one to have wrung the canary's neck. And because of that, Mrs. Wright, who has just been so frustrated and so annoyed and just done with Mr. Wright's harshness and demeaning character, that she ends up retaliating by strangling him at night. So it's the women, not the men, who come to this conclusion. And then they decide to hide the evidence from the men at the end of the play. So I think we'll start by talking a little about Mrs. Peters, who is played by Cindy. So Mrs. Peters, again, ends up deciding to hide the evidence. But it seems like it's definitely a very difficult decision for her because she's also married to the sheriff. So Cindy, do you want to talk a little bit about what do you think led Mrs. Peters to decide this?
Well, what I think led Mrs. Peters to decide this was just how, throughout, in the beginning of the play, you could just see Mrs. Peters as more of a passive character. She was more of she let the guys do whatever they had to do, and then she also defended them when Mrs. Hale was sort of talking bad about them in a sense. And towards the end, especially the part where she related Mrs. Wright's pain of the dead canary to her pain when her cat died when she was younger, and how she wanted to kill the kid that killed the cat. So in a sense, I feel like Mrs. Peters connected to Mrs. Wright, and because of that, she decided to just not tell the guys of why not tell the guys that Mrs. Wright was the one that killed her husband. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think that that's another big theme in the play, is that connection and bond that especially the women feel. to both each other and to Mrs. Wright. So we also have Mrs. Hale. I mentioned at the beginning that Susan Glassbell was an original cast member of this, and she was indeed. She did play Mrs. Hale in the original production of this. Now we have Elsa following in her footsteps as Mrs. Hale. So I think kind of going off of that theme of connection and bonding, Mrs. Hale, certainly is in defense of Mrs. Wright from the start, and then eventually bonds with Mrs. Peters, and they connect, and then they are on a united front at the end to defend Mrs. Wright. So, Elsa, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe how this is symbolic in some ways of the broader movements for women's rights and other progressive reforms at the time, which I think definitely relied in a lot of ways on the unified determination for change among its members?
Yeah, so at the time Trifles was written in 1916, women at the time could not vote in the United States even. And I think that's, something important to keep in mind. Like, the role of women was very different back then. They were meant to be like, don't speak unless spoken to. Your role is in the house, in the kitchen, doing very, I guess, domestic work. And particularly for the time, when I first learned about Susan Glassbell, I was just like, what an icon, Not only did she was she the co-owner of her own playhouse, but she was a reporter for, not trivial stuff. These are like murder cases she's reporting on. And she also, wrote her own short stories and plays. Like, that is incredible, especially for a woman of the era. And so one thing that really stood out to me when in terms of like Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters as kind of an analogy for the evolution of women's rights, I think it kind of makes sense how, Mrs. Hale is kind of like into it from the start, whereas Mrs. Peters is a little bit more hesitant, because when it comes to massively shifting, society's views of a group of people, there is a lot, particularly in terms of like gender roles, there's a lot that is kind of like entrenched to how we live our lives based on gender, particularly back then. And so to change that takes a lot of work, and you can't just outright say it, right? So even though Mrs. Hale, walks into that house knowing like, I don't want Mrs. Wright to go to jail. I don't want her to be punished for this, because I like she suspects that she knows what happened, and she doesn't almost. I this is a little bit more speculation, but I think almost out of her own like guilt for not being there for her when she needed somebody that could be here for her now, and defend her from the prison system. And so she didn't just come out and say whenever she and Mrs. Peters were alone, just like, hey, Mrs. Peters, I bet Mrs. Wright did it, but how about let's not tell the guys that? And maybe they'll also keep it quiet. No, she was very subtle about it at first. She was just like, oh, well, do you think she did it? Oh, you don't? Oh, yeah, definitely not. No. And so she was very like subtle about it. She made her point based off of, like, I guess, evidence, as opposed to, just trying to like wave it in her face all of a sudden, I guess. So similar to how it took a long time for women to be able to have a more equal part in society. And we are still working on aspects of that issue. Like, for example, Seneca Falls was like 1848. And still women couldn't vote until 1920. That's kind of crazy. That's like over 50 years, 70 years. Math. So, and even into like the 70s and 80s, women still didn't have, either full financial rights or rights in terms of like the workplace and things like that. So change happens slowly, especially when it's such a significant societal change. And so I think the fact that it was handled with, she had to handle it with subtlety, and then, Mrs. Peters kind of started out like, I'm not entirely sure like if she was like against women's rights, but like she was definitely more willing to be subservient at the beginning until she remembers those instances of her past where she realizes that like she had more stuff in common with Mrs. Wright and Mrs. Hale, and she's just like, okay, I'm going to support them. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that was some great stuff there. And yeah, a little bit of history too of how there's the Seneca Falls, as you mentioned. That was probably the first the Declaration of Women's Rights and Sentiments. I think it was what they wrote there, basing it off of the Declaration of Independence, saying all women are created equal, or maybe all men and women. I think that's what they say. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember it that well, but yeah, definitely. They start off that movement, but then it's a long road for them to finally get to the women's right to vote in the 1920s. And then even after that, still a long road ahead. And we're still fighting for, wealth equality and other things. But yeah, I think that's a great point of the persistency in having a movement and being unified, but willing to stick it out, even if it's a very long road ahead. Awesome. Okay. So I think now there was an audience question. I have to scroll back a little bit.
Yeah, there's a couple.
Yeah, so I think this one would be good. What are the challenges of doing a reading over Zoom versus in person, and are there any advantages?
Well, oh, go ahead.
Wow.
Maybe we'll start with Fook.
Yeah. So if you're talking about Steven's drama specific stuff, biggest difficulty is that we're not with everyone else who are amazing people and are extremely supportive during this stuff. The difficulty is that we don't exactly have the spatial aspect of the play going on, and we don't quite visualize just how the stage actions go. And now, for me, for the most part, since I only have a total of 10 lines, and 10 lines, all of which are just relatively minor, it's not much of a problem, but I would imagine it is quite a significant one for the women who are largely the centerpiece of this play.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I guess I can add on. Oh,
go for it.
Maybe we'll go Elsa and then Alex, if that's all right.
Oh, okay.
Elsa, Elsa,
I was just gonna bring up like the point of like, obviously there's like lag, internet cuts out. You'll love to see it. The inevitable technical difficulties, which don't happen as much when you do run it in person. But there's also like a certain intensity that you get from being, together in a space, which is more difficult to create virtually. And then like a couple of other things, especially because this is like a mystery, and so much of it has to do with, especially the female characters uncovering, the evidence with like the bread and like the whole house being messy, but some pieces being like clean, and then with the quilt, things like that. I feel like would translate better visually than they do just being read, and it would ratchet up the tension a little bit higher. But I think this has actually gone really well. I'm very happy with how it turned out.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Alex, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess I could just reiterate the points that Fook and Elsa made. With one, there is just a certain natural energy that comes with doing a read through in person, where you get to see everyone in person. You get to speak directly to them, as opposed to just speaking to to a computer screen, which I'm sure we're all sick of at this point, but it's unfortunate. And there's just something about like seeing people in person, getting to say your lines directly
So many traditions
to them.
gone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's true. Also, the traditions that go around making a show, getting hype beforehand or celebrating afterwards. It's hard to do all of those things.
Yeah, this is a new concept, so it's still a little awkward. Obviously, not as natural as an in-person show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
If I could. I don't think anyone has mentioned the most obvious benefit of a virtual reading, and that is that we can have the script open in the next tab.
You're exposing us over
Good
here.
drinking game. Actually, don't. But guess when we're reading from the
Alright.
script and when we're memorizing.
Oh man.
Right.
But I guess one of the biggest downsides is internet problems.
Yeah, you handled it well though. It was good though. Don't worry.
I just think it's funny. I was joking about it before the show started, and then it happened.
It's an SDS tradition. We got to get through every show with at least like one thing going wrong.
Oh no, yeah. It's gone a lot worse.
Exactly. Exactly.
Power's gone out during a show for me once.
Really?
Right in the middle of a show, right before I was about to walk on.
In my case, it was the mustache falling off. Was it? Did you have to-
Oh, we all have good times.
Yeah.
Good time.
We'll be back one day, and there are plenty of Stephen's drama traditions with which we shall torture you.
Woohoo.
I'm excited to be back with you guys.
Yeah.
I agree, chat. I agree.
Oh,
Finally get to give you guys a tour of the bar. You don't even know most of it. There are some places within which most of us at the Bond have not even entered.
Oh man,
It's like Indiana Jones. You're raiding the jungle or something.
that's true. You guys haven't been into Bond. Wow.
Yeah. For the new.
Actually, Cindy and I have. Heck yeah.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah,
But not
Devon
backstage. Right? Have you? The Bond
Oh,
backstage
no.
is
Okay.
the Bond
Wait.
backstage is a mess.
I
We
mean,
go
I went
in the
to
backstage door.
We don't know what goes on. We don't know what goes on backstage. Don't want to know either.
All right. Anyway.
All right. Yeah, so
I think we're going on topic now.
let's see. There was another audience question a little further back. I guess this also kind of goes into sort of the acting experience of it. What did you learn about gender roles and expectations by doing the show?
Oh. I mean, I guess I can answer this.
Okay,
Just because,
yeah.
like, I'm the woman. Okay, so, basically what I learned about gender roles was just that, like, I think, like, just because of, like, the time period, women had more of, like, or they're supposed to. Mrs. Hale doesn't really, like, show this. She has more of, like, a passive role, and this can be seen with, like, Mrs. Peters, where, like, it was taught that, like, it's a guy's duty to, like, let's say, it's, like, solve a murder case. But then the irony is that the women were the ones that actually solved the murder case. So, and then that will be, like, so, like, yeah, it's, like, pretty interesting. It's, like, it's more like men have, like, a more power or, like, more control, kind of like a gender society expectations in this, like, trifles time period. Yes.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I think that one of the things I thought was really interesting is that it's almost like a different take on the strong female character, because I know this is something I've been looking at a lot recently because I have to write a Cal essay on it. But in terms of, like, representation, a lot of the times in movies nowadays we see when people have been trying to get more female representation, you see like, strong female characters who are just like, oh no, I don't need no man or whatever. You know the people I'm talking about, right? And but in that instance, they almost become flattened to their own trope. Like, is that better? That's not better representation, because it's just the same character over and over again. It's the same problem as with showing only girly girls or whatever. And so I think that, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are both really great, strong female characters that, because because Mrs. Peters, standing up for her fellow women, and also Mrs. Hale for just, not taking any garbage from the men when they're trying to, put down other women, and even though they're not like, jumping off trains and shooting people or whatever, they're still very strong female characters. And I really love that. I don't know if that answered the question, but
no, that was good. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'll add a little too, because, I mentioned in the playbill that I had no idea who Susan Glaspell was until like this past summer, and like just learning more about her it was so interesting of how she was a journalist and a playwright in a time when, again, women were more expected to marry and then keep up with house chores and keeping the house nice, which was definitely still an important job, but it was demeaning also in a way. But Glaspell was certainly revolutionary in not only being in these traditionally male roles, but also really starting a movement of modern American theater that has led on to today. And now we're here still performing theater because we love it so much. And I think that, that definitely, we can trace it all the way back to Susan Glaspell saying, hey, people might not like what I say, or they might be against what I say, but this is what I have to tell other people. This is my story. So I'm going to share it with the world, which I think is really, that was something that was so cool to me, learning about Susan Glaspell and then eventually deciding to take up this project. Mm-hmm. All right, cool. So I think one more thing, we have a special guest for the last few minutes, and that is the president of SDS, Cameron Clifford.
Hey.
There he is.
Great job tonight. Great job, all of you. Thank you so much, Charlie. Wonderful work. And all the actors as well. Thank you so much. I just wanted to pop on and say that. And also a quick advertisement. In 2 weeks' time, we will be showing Your Good Man, Charlie Brown. That is not going to be on the YouTube channel. That's on a separate site. Hopefully someone can throw that in the chat. So you guys can reserve your tickets. It's free. Cameron Clifford, the press. Yeah, so please, we would love to have you come out and see that. We've also put a lot of work, hard work into that. Just to give you a little rundown of what's going on with that, that is a musical, and we filmed it all in Hoboken with Stephen's students, from phone cameras, quite on a budget. And we would really love for everyone to be able to come out, show your support. We're actually going to be showing a short little preview on a different stream this evening. If you'd like to pop over there, it is one of the video editors. And so I think Derek is going to throw that in the chat window as well. So if you want to hop on that after this, please feel free, and you can see a little sneak peek of Charlie Brown. That's a surprise to everyone. So yeah, so be sure to hop on over there after this.
Exciting.
Awesome. Yeah.
Exciting. Quite.
Cool. Well, thank you again, everyone. This was, I think, a wonderful event. I'm so happy to have been a part of this. Thank you to the cast for such a wonderful job. And yeah, this was a great Friday night. So hope you guys have a good weekend and can hopefully enjoy Thanksgiving. And yeah, we're almost done with 2020. So
Stay safe, everyone.
very cool.
Stay
We're-
very safe for the next few
the lights
weeks,
at
all
the end of
right?
the tunnel. So okay, cool. So I think I will end the broadcast, but thank you so much. Have a wonderful night, everyone.